I'm Laurence Nardon. I'm the head of the program on the United States here at Ifri, and I'm very proud to introduce the panel on foreign affairs, on US foreign policy, excuse me, that we have in the afternoon of the annual conference every year, and this is the 18th edition, and I'm very proud of that. It's my moment of pride, forgive me. And usually in this afternoon session, we cover the hot spots of American foreign policy. And every year, usually, you will have a panelist address US policy in the Middle East. Another one will address US policy towards China, and another one will address US policy towards, say, Russia and Central Europe or Ukraine, which is always very interesting. But this year, I thought we'd have a little departure from tradition and cover a broader issue, which is the transformation or the new trends of foreign policy thinking in the United States. As you know, not starting with Donald Trump, but very much enhanced by Donald Trump, there's been a trend in US foreign policy towards being more reluctant to engage in foreign affairs. And the question I'm going to ask our panelists today is whether these trends are very serious, how they would describe them, and whether they can change if a Democratic president is elected next year or not, or not change, is what I mean. In recent months, we've heard of the creation of new think tanks in Washington, D.C., illustrating these new trends. Gordon here will tell us about one of those think tanks, which is the Quincy Institute, but I won't go more into that because you will address it. There's also another think tank that's called the Edmund Burke Foundation. I don't know if it's foundation or institute, but Edmund Burke, that has quite nationalist overtones. So that's also one of those things that I want to address today with you, see how American foreign affairs may evolve in coming years. And because we're in Paris, we are very lucky to have the director of the policy planning at the Foreign Affairs Ministry, who will tell us what France is doing. France and Europe is thinking about US foreign policy, what we might be seeing from the Quai d'Orsay in coming months or years. But I haven't presented the two American speakers that will speak first. On my right is Gordon Adams, whom I've known for decades, really, and who used to work at the Office of Management and Budget very long ago, then worked for the Clinton administration. And anything else I should know at this point?
Since then, basically making trouble.
Okay. And on my left is Michael Lind, who's a very prolific thinker. He wrote that book on Texas years ago that I read with so much interest. What, Made in Texas?
Exactly.
Okay. And you're also a founder of this institute, the New America Institute. Mm-hmm. But you left them and now you're a teacher in Texas again.
My native state.
Yes. Okay, so we decided that Gordon would speak first and tell us about his view of the direction or directions that US foreign policy thinking is going to. Merci.
Thank you, Laurence. Very happy to be here. Thank you for the invitation. Very happy to come and speak here. I am a self-confessed Francophile, having lived in Tours long ago. And because the rules of the Fulbright program would not allow me to come back as a Fulbright fellow after I did that, I went to Belgium, which was as close as I could get to the Collège d'Europe, and I lived and worked in Belgium for 3 years as well. So it's always wonderful to come back and speak again.
Actually, you could make this presentation in French if you chose to. But that wouldn't be nice for Michael, who doesn't speak French. So.
Il sait ce que je vais dire. Yes, but for precision of thought, I'm going to try to keep it in English, and we'll go back and forth and see how that goes. I want to try to do here several things, and hopefully not take too much time doing it. First, I want to step back for a moment and briefly describe, at least from my point of view, what the evolution is in the international system. Because part of what we see facing and challenging U.S. foreign policy at this point is an external change, and we do tend to spend an awful lot of time looking at the United States as the driver of the international system. And since I believe that the international system is now evolving in directions the U.S. does not drive, it's an important precondition for talking about how the United States might look at foreign policy. Then, having done that, I want to talk a little bit about how that changes what have been the dominant trends in U.S. foreign policy, just itemizing those, and then talk about, at least from my point of view, and the other speakers may have a different taxonomy, but present a taxonomy of what the views are that exist now today in the United States about the way the United States can or should engage the rest of the world under changed conditions. And in that framework, I'll say a few things about the Quincy Institute. So first, with respect to what has happened, mostly in the media, and this morning's panel, I think, was not in any way different. Mostly in the media, we deal with the day-to-day impression. And so the arrival of Donald Trump in the presidency and the unpredictability, destabilizing quality of decisions, somewhat ad hoc methodology for foreign policy in the Trump administration dominates the discussion, the way the most recent NATO summit dominated the media discussion of Donald Trump's foreign policy. I have said myself, since the very moment that Donald Trump became president, that it would be very dangerous for the media or anybody else to normalize the Trump administration. It always seemed to me, because of the idiosyncrasies of the president, it was going to be an administration that was unpredictable. And it has remained unpredictable. So saying this is a norm for American foreign policy, I think, is going too far. But that unpredictability behind it has a kind of a worldview that I'm going to come back and talk about in a moment. But as I said, I wanted to, because I think it's not normal but unpredictable, I wanted to step back and say for a moment, what has changed, in my view at least, in the world that makes for a diversity of views in the United States about how the United States should engage the world. And I will just be very brief, but I think, to me, the key thing that has happened beginning after the fall of the Berlin Wall, but especially accelerated in the 21st century, is a rebalancing of power in the globe. That's fundamental to me. China's rise, which is inevitable, the posing of an alternative way of internal governance and international rules by a rising China have changed the system. The ability of Putin's Russia to play a fairly weak hand in power terms very smartly is another change in the international system. We do tend to focus on those two rising powers, and in fact, one school of American engagement theory does that. Russia, China, it's about great power competition. But I think beneath that, we have to look at some very important changes in regional power balances. That the rise of a Turkey, Iran, Saudi competition in the Middle East, which the United States can no longer control or direct, is a regional balance of power of some significance for U.S. foreign policy. The adjustment of Latin American countries to the rise of China and to doing business with Chinese companies and with the Chinese government is another regional alteration that balances a previous U.S. dominance in the Latin American region. The economic changes in the global system have altered the American economic dominance of the international system. With the United States as a debtor nation, with the globalization of private capital. I won't go in depth into any of these, but that says that regional power balances, the global power balance, the economic balance in the globe have all altered evolutionarily, independent of anything Donald Trump did. And that has changed the way the United States stands in the world and the way it has to engage. The trailing change, if you will, the last piece to begin to alter is the military dominance of the United States, which has always had the only truly global military with a capacity to deploy anywhere, fly anywhere, sail anywhere, with global intelligence, logistics, basing architecture, communications architecture. It's the only military that has that capability, and it remains today the only military that has a truly global capability, but that is changing. It's especially changing regionally. So all of these changes in the international system have, frankly, very little to do with Donald Trump. They have to do with major evolutions in the system that the United States does not control. They have to do with the impact of decolonization. They have to do with the end of the Cold War. They have to do with the phenomenon of globalization, and they are the descendant, in my judgment, of some American foreign policy decisions. Failure in Iraq and Afghanistan, NATO enlargement, we can discuss how, the role of rising other countries in the global commons, failures in nation building, and military failures. It's worth pointing out that aside from the Gulf War, the American military does not have an unchallenged record of military success since the end of the Second World War. We can come back and talk about that. So what does that mean for the United States? I think some fairly fundamental changes. The end of American hegemony. The end of the role of the United States as what Madeleine Albright called the indispensable nation. The end of American leadership of a fictional notion called the West. The end of the role as the protector of the global commons. The end of a role as the global security provider. The end of the role as the guarantor of a rules-based international order. The end, if you will, of American exceptionalism. All those things are disappearing, and I would call Donald Trump an accelerant in that evolution. It is not that he is doing something dramatically new and different and creating a whole new way of engaging. He is supercharging that process of change and that change in the American role by what he has been doing. So where does that leave us in the way the United States is various ways and places thinking about engaging the world differently? There is behind, I think, Donald Trump a still somewhat vague, not necessarily coherent, but a worldview, and I would call it one that is characterized by assertive nationalism, one that is unilateral in the mode of engagement, one which emphasizes military predominance but not military intervention, a transactional, interest-driven view of how one engages internationally, an end to American nation building, greater intention to rely on others, Europe being one of them, to provide for their own security. If you will, interests over values. That may be one school of thought that I think is loosely associated with Donald Trump. I hasten to add, I don't think he has a thought architecture that coherent. But behind his engagement, I think those ideas are fairly consistent in the way the Trump administration is engaged. The second I would call a school of neoconservative hegemony. Probably Robert Kagan, John Bolton, the inheritors of the Iraq invasion, if you will, which has an instinct for global dominance, use of the military tool predominantly, and a fairly unilateral view of how the United States ought to engage globally. It is a very global focus. Donald Trump's focus, the American nationalist focus, is not a global focus. It's a very transactional focus. The neoconservative trend in American foreign policy is very globally focused. The idea is to maintain predominance, to maintain dominance, especially militarily, globally. Thirdly, I would call the school that we're all most familiar with, which has both conservative and liberal versions, but is essentially what we have seen for the last 70 years. Either a more interventionist or a more internationalist mode of American engagement. It's what Ben Rhodes described during the Obama administration as the blob. The blob is the massive trend of American foreign policy, where the United States is the indispensable nation, is the necessary global leader, leads the rules-based international order. It uses the military more or less, whether you're more liberal or more conservative, but it's intentionally global and intentionally interventionist. And underneath that, a tendency to describe American foreign policy as driven by values rather than interests. I would argue that values focus conceals a very interest-driven engagement, but that's a longer discussion. It is explicitly multilateral in focus, not unilateral in focus, right? And a number of spokespersons, right, left, and center. John McCain characterizes the more conservative version, or did. Bret Stephens, who writes for the New York Times, is a somewhat softer version of that. Hillary Clinton in her campaign, very much a version of that. It's what you all know as close and familiar as American foreign policy. Swings a little more conservative, swings a little more liberal, but the intention is global, the intention is to engage. And that's third. Fourth, I think there's an emerging community or an opening for an option that I would call restraint. This is very much where I'll say something about the Quincy Institute, because I think the Quincy Institute, disclosure, I am a fellow of the Quincy Institute, finds itself newly engaged in defining the way the United States needs to deal with the changes that I talked about at the top, deal with the changes that are happening in the global system. And that, you can associate it with people that you may know, like Paul Pillar, Andy Bacevich, Steve Walt, John Mearsheimer, with various tendencies within them. They don't all agree on everything, but the idea here is to, as John Quincy Adams put it, hence the name Quincy Institute. John Quincy Adams put it in 1821, the U.S. does not go abroad in search of monsters to destroy. That's where the Quincy Institute takes its name from. It emphasizes diplomacy and strengthening the diplomatic toolkit in the United States. Self-advertisement at the new Quincy Institute website. I have a piece up yesterday on how to fix diplomacy and foreign assistance in the United States. It is global in focus, but not global in implementation. There's a rejection of the role of global police officer in this tradition that's being created. The military is something to be used as a last resort, not something to be used to impose order, change governments, or build nations. The United States is not seen as an exceptional nation, but as another power player, if you will. It's very realistically based in the global system. It is very multilateral in focus because the United States, from this tendency, should not be looking to run every organization or solve every problem. And many of the people associated with the Quincy Institute are realists. Walt is clearly defined, self-defined as a realist. Mearsheimer self-defined as a realist. The evolution, those are the four tendencies, and the Quincy Institute pulls together, I think for the first time, a number of people who've been writing from this restraint position into one organization to give it more depth, more analysis, more impact. The evolution to this newly changed world is going to be slow. The America First approach, which could be characterized as Trumpian, is a disruptive accelerant, as I said. The neoconservative version that I talked about would be an accelerant if it were in charge. John Bolton didn't last forever, you may have noticed. But that tendency would involve more unilateralist global assertion of military power, which would accelerate the trends that I have pointed to in the globe. The interventionist international leadership is very strong in both parties. It is strong both in parts of the Republican Party, and it is very strong in the Democratic Party as a tendency, which is let's return to normal. When November comes and whoever the Democrat is elected president, we will revert to normal. Everybody can relax. The Europeans can relax. Everybody can say, well, we've gone back to the usual rules of the day. I don't think so. I think, in fact, either of the more conservative or more liberal, multilateral, interventionist, global tendency is going to confront a changed reality, and we'll have to change to confront that reality. But the blob is alive and well in Washington, D.C. And the restraint version, at least in my judgment, I'm biased, it represents the only attempt to grapple with this change in the global system and redefine the American role. In conclusion, I am instructed by one of the things that George Kennan wrote very later in his life, which is that respect comes from a resolute and courageous liquidation of unsound positions. I'll repeat that. Respect comes from a resolute and courageous liquidation of unsound positions, not from the stubborn pursuit of extravagant or unpromising objectives. Not from the stubborn pursuit of extravagant or unpromising objectives. And Henry Kissinger may have actually captured some of the moment that we're in, which I will also quote. Kissinger said, "I think Trump may be one of those figures in history who appears from time to mark the end of an era, and to force it to give up its old pretenses. It doesn't necessarily mean that he knows this, or that he is considering any great alternative. It could just be an accident." That's Henry Kissinger, you know. But beware, because there will be reactions in the U.S. to this reality. As reality changes, you're going to have kickback. I think in part that's part of what Trump represents. Bob Corker said several years ago, former Senator Corker, who was a never-Trumper who basically left the Senate, he explained, quote, "The American people absolutely would not be prepared psychologically for an event where the world began to believe that it was not the greatest power on earth." So beware the potential kickback in American foreign policy. Thank you.
Thank you, Gordon. And now, Michael, over to you if you've got anything left to say.
There's a certain amount of overlap. Well, many of you may have read in the American press and foreign policy punditry that there was an unbroken tradition of liberal internationalism and engagement in the world of all presidents, from Franklin Roosevelt up until Barack Obama. And then suddenly there was this drastic rupture with Donald Trump. So I'm going to suggest that the actual rupture came between George W. Bush and Barack Obama, and that we're in the post-Bush era, just as there was a Vietnam syndrome that lasted all the way up until the Gulf War in 1991, and made both the public and politicians much more cautious in military interventions. I think that historians will look back and see continuities between the Clinton administration and the administration of George W. Bush, and then a break in the first post-Bush strategy is Barack Obama's, and the second is Donald Trump's. And although their styles are diametrically opposite, there are some parallels in continuity between Obama and Trump arising from this. So let's begin with the continuities between Bill Clinton and George W. Bush. The consensus vision in Washington, and I was there at the time, Gordon was there much of the time, was that was hegemony. Now, hegemony is different from primacy because hegemony it combines authority with power. It combines a legitimacy with power. That is, the other nations in the world think that your power is legitimate and they benefit from it. And the United States, during the Cold War, was not really the leader of a traditional alliance. It was the leader of a hegemonic bloc in which the two biggest, most important industrial capitalist nations, West Germany and Japan, were demilitarized protectorates of the United States, semi-sovereign states. Well, not completely demilitarized, but subordinate to American leadership. And I was a guest of honor at one of my book parties at SAIS with then Dean Paul Wolfowitz in 1995, who had authored the 1992 Pentagon Planning Guidance, which said that the United States would see to it that no new great powers emerged, no peer competitors, and would reassure existing great powers that the U.S. would take care of their legitimate interests. So I asked, I thought this was mad at the time, but he was just a professor, he's a dean. I had no idea he would go back into government. So I just asked him, well, how would he deal with China? And he said, well, China will see the benefit of participating in our system. And I said, well, what about Russia? Well, Russia will see the benefit. So this was a plan. It was an intelligent plan. I think it was unrealistic, but the idea was, just as the U.S. had provided for the security of the defeated Axis powers of Japan and West Germany during the Cold War, and encouraged them to specialize in manufacturing rather than armaments. So China and Russia, the U.S. would police their near abroad. So, it was an interesting political science theory. I thought it was rather dubious, but that was the dominant consensus. And in pursuit of this hegemony theory, the U.S. was not just was not just trying to police the Middle East and East Asia and Europe and Eastern Europe with the expansion of NATO, but it also provided services to the international community. One was the dollar as a reserve currency at great cost to our manufacturing in many cases. Another service was being the consumer of last resort, sometimes the consumer of first resort in the case of our East Asian allies, basically turning the other way when they protected their markets and then targeted market share in the United States. So this was in my interpretation, the idea was we would take this Pax Americana hegemonic alliance that had originally been constructed to keep Germany and Japan demilitarized. We would expand it on a global level through a combination of deterrence and providing favors and services. The post-Soviet Russians and the post-Maoist Chinese would see their subordinate place in this Pax Americana. Well, by 2008, it was clear from China's behavior that this was not going to happen. And this became increasingly clear over time with their building the Great Wall of Sand. The event that really sent a shockwave through the American business as well as intellectual and military community was the Made in China 2025 program, where China announced it was going to squeeze the U.S. out of these leading high-tech sectors like AI and robotics and so on. Now, the plan had been, from Washington's point of view, that China would do low-skill labor, low-value-added labor, and keep buying the chips and the AIs and the software from the United States. And here they were saying, we're going to use mercantilist, economic nationalist, Colbert type, since this is France, industrial policy to drive you out, first of the Chinese market and then out of global markets, if we can. So this whole, and at that point it became clear that you can't have a Pax Americana if the world's most populous nation and what will soon be the largest economy is not going to agree to be subordinate the way West Germany and Japan were. So the response to that, I think we've had two presidents and we've had two strategies. Both Obama and Bush, and Trump, I like the term primacist. Gordon may know who came up with this, but I think you'll agree this is different from restraint. It's primacy. But primacy is different from hegemony because it assumes that not everybody in the world accepts you as a hegemon. In the Obama administration's way of dealing with the rise of China was to abandon the goal of having a global market with a single set of rules and to say, okay, plan B is we will create a smaller market, but it's still the dominant market in the world, consisting of the US, EU, and our East Asian allies and dependencies. If you go back and read what President Obama said and his administration said about the Trans-Pacific Partnership, the TPP, and the Euro-American trade negotiation, the TTIP, Transatlantic Trade and Investment Partnership. Yeah. The Obama administration sold this as containment of China explicitly. They said the idea was, and I'm more or less quoting from President Obama, we and our allies will write the rules of world trade for the future. China will not participate because it's economic nationalist and mercantilist and all of that. China will be forced to liberalize its own economy in order to participate with the East Asian democracies and with Europe and with North America in this giant economic bloc, which would have 60% of the world's GDP, even without China. So, and I knew people at the State Department, that was their thinking. It went horribly wrong. I partly blame Michael Froman, the U.S. trade representative. The way these multi-regional trade pacts are done in the U.S., they're announced, and then the USTR, not Robert Lighthizer, the present one, but previous USTRs, invite major U.S. corporations and industries to give a wish list of what you want. So the way the TPP eventually, what emerged, was not actually a coherent anti-Chinese rule writing exercise. It was essentially pharmaceutical companies in the US and Wall Street banks basically coming up with rules for US-Asian trade so that they could open up the Malaysian market and the Indonesian market. And the other thing about the TPP that you have to understand is Japan joined at a late phase. Since Japan and the US together had, I don't know, something like 2/3 of the GDP of all of the TPP members. There were really two TPPs. One was a US-Japan trade deal, and the other was the US and ASEAN countries, a number of very small countries, where the US TR was pushing, to my mind, very unfair pro-American industrial provisions, like long pharmaceutical patents and opening up their banks to foreign ownership on these ASEAN countries. Meanwhile, the Japanese, having gotten the better of American trade negotiators for the last 50 years, were doing their usual thing, saying, well, we'll open up some of our agricultural market to your farmers if you let us take even more market share from your manufacturers. And the Chinese have learned this now from the Japanese, right? That's okay, we'll wipe out your car industry. Oh, but we love your soybeans, right? So the TPP, which has started out as part of this geostrategic plan of containing China, ended up just being a corporate wish list, and that's when the Democrats largely turned against it. The Democratic Party itself, Hillary Clinton had to denounce it after having supported it. The TTIP, the Euro-American Trade Agreement, as I understand it, foundered on the fear of European farmers of competition and flooding of imports and GM rules and things like that. But my point is, the two major economic initiatives of the Obama administration in international affairs were explicitly stated to be subordinate to anti-Chinese geopolitics, but in a multilateral way. That is, saving as much as you can of hegemony of this international global market, but just China's out of it now, maybe they can participate in the future. So Trump's has been radical. It's the same goal. It's preserving U.S. primacy without hegemony. Trump is not an isolationist. He's a unilateralist, but it does not want to. He wants to rebalance things, and as I see the Trump administration's basic grand strategy, it's Asia first. That is, it thinks we're in a Cold War with China, and you make a case for this. And that China is now what the Trump administration calls a strategic rival, as well as a commercial, predatory, economic rival. And it's the biggest threat. And Russia and Iran are secondary interests to this. So that's both of these administrations. And of course, Obama had the pivot to Asia militarily, which did not amount to much in terms of actual military assets, but it did create a lasting legacy in the concept of the Indo-Pacific, which is very clever, kind of Orwellian language when we say, oh, well, America has always defended the Indo-Pacific region. Like, yeah, we did, really? The Indian Ocean? This is very clearly anti-Chinese naval encirclement. And in the Obama years, you saw the beginning of the quadrilateral alliance of the U.S., Japan, Australia, and India, which the anti-Chinese nature of this is quite manifest, not least to the Chinese. So we get these two different responses. Now, going forward, and I'll just wrap up with this, I think these two responses, these will define the options in the near future. The actual defenders of the old neoconservative hegemony option, as Gordon has said, politically this is poison now. Both Trump and Obama got their party nominations in part because they opposed or denounced the Iraq War. One of the reasons Hillary Clinton lost the nomination to Barack Obama was that she had voted for the Iraq War, which by 2008 was very unpopular with the American people and with Democratic primary voters in particular. And Obama was on record opposing it as a state legislator at the time, if memory serves. Trump claims that he opposed the Iraq War at the time. I don't think anyone's been able to document this. But he was the only one of 12 or 13 Republican candidates on the stage who said the Iraq War was a mistake. It was a stupid idea. And this was one of the reasons he became the nominee. If you do not believe he was installed by Putin putting cartoons on the internet anyway, but because the Republican base had turned against the Iraq War, and the entire public has. So that's why I say we're in a post-Iraq syndrome era, like the post-Vietnam era, where no more nation-building wars. Obama was elected to wind down the two wars started by George W. Bush in Afghanistan and Iraq. He increased the Afghan war with the surge. He tried to wind down the Iraq war. Then I think, to his lasting discredit, he intervened in Syria and Libya. So Trump then inherited 4 wars. And actually, if you count the war against the Houthis in Yemen, then this is like 5 wars. So, but that's also part of this era. The public really wants these Middle Eastern wars to be wound down. So what is, Europe's role in all of this? Well, there's good news and bad news. The good news is, well, let me say the bad news is Europe is at the very bottom of America's strategic priorities. That's also the good news, because America's strategic priorities are based on perceptions in Washington, D.C. of threats. Europe is not seen as a threat, either militarily or commercially. This is great from the point of view of Euro-American relations. But I'm sad to tell you, my European friends, it means that you're an afterthought. That is, Washington naturally concentrates on what the leadership thinks are threats, and China is the big one. The older establishment, largely the military and foreign service, is obsessed with Iran and Russia in a way that neither Obama and Trump have been. But that's kind of an alternate flavor. But so whether you're Middle East first or Asia first, Europe is always last, because Europe is not threatening. I mean, it's sort of taken for granted. It's fine, right? It's Europe. You know, Trump would like to rebalance the payments a little bit, but he's not going to abolish NATO. That's bargaining talk, in my opinion. So of these strategies, what is the most threatening to European interests and practices as they're going now? I think it's the geoeconomic, the trade war, if you want to call it that, with China. Because Europe is in a position where it can suffer as collateral damage in the increasingly intense trade war between the United States and China, which has gotten a lot of support from business circles that did not support it earlier, partly because of the nature of the Xi Jinping regime and their economic nationalism. They're no longer seen as this great open market and we're all going to make money there. There's seems they're going to squeeze us and take our technology and then force us out of global markets. So what had been a kind of balance of power between the business community, which wanted to be open to China, and the Pentagon, which always, that's their job. They saw China as a military threat. Now there's more and more defecting to the threat side. It's a trade, it's an economic threat and a military threat. And I think that's going to last. And now why does this affect Europe? Again, it affects Europe incidentally. The problem is, if the US is really going to decouple from China and make sure its supply chains of militarily relevant industries are secure, then they will sooner or later look at other regions, Latin America and Europe and so on, and say, is this a backdoor for Chinese industry, China's state-controlled industry, right? So is this product from Europe actually really mostly made of Chinese parts? I'm not defending this logic, I'm just saying that that is going to be the logic. That was one of the criticisms of the TPP, that it did not do enough to prevent ASEAN countries and others from essentially just assembling Chinese goods, so that China was technically not part of the TPP, but through the inputs, the products could be largely Chinese. And I'll end with one note, because no one talks about this. Trump has done what Obama promised to do but did not, which was renegotiate NAFTA. Very unpopular in the American industrial states in the Midwest, because so much industry has migrated to Mexico for the lower wages and lower regulations. The USMCA, the US-Mexico-Canada Agreement, raises the North American content of products that are accepted under NAFTA for this favorable treatment to 70%. I think that's the number. It also created a minimum wage in certain industries in Mexico, which the Mexicans are resisting. But this just shows you, if the US is really intent on preserving or getting back some strategic supply chains, then Europe, again, incidentally, it's not that the US is anti-European, but so for example, this affects European trade. through NAFTA. So if you're, Daimler-Benz or something and you're in Mexico, then you can't just import your products, right? And then get this largely German automobile, being passed off as North American. So that's what I would advise Europeans to look out for, being collateral damage in this geoeconomic struggle.
Thank you, Michael. And now I turn to Manuel, who will tell us what we plan to do, not to be collateral.
Thank you, Laurence. So the discussion is about the US foreign policy under Trump, and the paradox is that it's both easy and difficult to characterize that US foreign policy. It's easy because in terms of methods, it's been said already, it's very transactional. Look at NATO, for instance. It's quite unilateral. It sees multilateral framework and rules and institutions as constraints, as attacks against national sovereignty. It follows zero-sum game logic. And it's very comfortable with polarized relations, international relations. And on substance, there is this priority to great power competition. China rather than Russia, I agree with that. There is neglect for global affairs. Climate is a good example. There's neglect for some allies, except maybe Israel. And it's actually has been increasingly easy to characterize that foreign policy because what people discussed, some people discussed at the beginning as pullback forces, the way Congress would play or the way the so-called adults in the room would play, these have been progressively sidelined. And yet, at least as a practitioner, it's quite difficult to characterize that policy because it's unpredictable, and it is meant to be unpredictable. And you have quite striking U-turns. It's not just a theory, but in practice, I mean, look at how the policy on North Korea started and look at where we are now. This is quite a significant U-turn. On Syria, for France in particular, the U-turn of US military presence in the northeast is also quite striking. And these U-turns sometimes come with some contradictions, as it's not the first time that the US say they will leave Syria, and it's not the first time that then you learn that they will leave, but some military troops will still remain. So I work with policy planning. CAPS is the policy planning staff of the French Ministry for Europe and Foreign Affairs. So what we do is contribute to the ministry's strategic thinking. What I'm going to say is not the expression of official positions, but here's how we look at this issue. My first point is, and that has been said differently already, but not by me, so I will repeat it. That's the rule of the game. That the Trump presidency is more a symptom of something that runs deeper in the US. It's a symptom of a now open and clear and somewhat unavoidable phenomenon, which is that Americans themselves no longer agree on what their country should, the role that their country should play in the world. There's a crisis of the US foreign policy consensus, a crisis that started with the end of the Cold War, was probably somewhat suspended for some time after 9/11. That suspension then broke out because of the Iraq War, and that crisis is now completely out in the open. And grand strategy debates in the US have not been as wide and lively as they are now for decades. And if you look at where this is going, there is not really a solution around the corner. I mean, a majority of Americans understand, come to the conclusion that they don't want to see the US running the world anymore. And yet, they also see that there are major challenges ahead, China, of course, but quite a few others, including climate, whether the US wants it or not. And this reluctance of the US, not vis-à-vis the status of a superpower, but the responsibilities that come with power, is the defining question. And that situation, that debate, creates some kind of a global vacuum in leadership. And you could see that vacuum as helping the prophecy to self-fulfilled. The second point is there's a discussion about how much of a continuity is there between Obama and Trump. We just heard about elements of continuity. Indeed, there are similarities in the will to shoulder less burden, in the reordering of regional priorities, in the reluctance to intervene militarily. They all echo currents in American public opinion, that's quite clear. But as a practitioner, I can tell you that there are also quite striking differences between Obama and Trump, and that they are not only in style. They precisely have a very different vision of the world, of the US role in the world, and of the role of allies and partners. For Obama, as my colleague Maya Kandel says, for Obama, multilateralism and allies were a necessary part of the solution. And for Trump, they are fundamentally, they are the problem. This comes with a few consequences for us Europeans. Let me take just 3 examples with one specific case, which is Iran. If you look at the US policy on Iran, so one aspect is sanctions. I think you mentioned that morning. Unfortunately, I could not be there. I think the way the US has used the threat of US secondary sanctions against Europe is very telling. In most cases, we disagree, but we agree to disagree. These sanctions, the threat of these sanctions, is a moment when the US does not agree to disagree with Europe. But on the contrary, there is political will to force alignment of our foreign policy on US interest with this sanction tool. That brings to a second big issue for Europeans, which is our foreign policy credibility. The problem is not just the sanctions, it's what the sanctions do to our foreign policy credibility. Why would third partners negotiate with us Europeans if they believe that US sanctions can basically hollow out any agreements that we find, that we conclude with the party with whom we are negotiating? That's a big issue for Europeans, and I think that's what Europeans are starting to grapple with. But there's another aspect which is quite interesting, which is what is taking place, has to do with what is taking place in the region right now, which is the risk of escalation. The maximal pressure policy against Iran was supported by quite a few states, governments in the region, until they realized what it meant, which is that there was a risk of military escalation and that they were just in the front row. It's not, the issue is not so much, as I see it, maximal pressure as such, that the fact that there is no political strategy around maximal pressure. If you accumulate pressure, it's good to have somewhere, something for that pressure to evacuate. And that is supposedly the political negotiation. If you just accumulate pressure without that political exit, then there is a risk. And that risk is even more problematic if at the same time, in the same region, you have questions about the credibility of US security guarantees. And we know for a fact that this is the case in major countries in the region right now. So just to be clear, I don't want to say that there's nothing that we can do with the current US government in foreign policy. There's a lot going on in terms of cooperation. We have, for instance, I believe in Washington, some decent credibility of a French defense policy, which precisely has to do with what in France we called strategic autonomy. Actually, that's something that not just the French call now, but Europeans call. They have adopted that concept in 2016. And we are supposedly, we are meant to be working on increasing that strategic autonomy. The G7 summit, I think most people in the room, if we had asked you before the summit, how is that going to turn out? The majority of the responses would have been bad, and there was a precedent for that. I think it turned out better than most people had anticipated. There is room for dialogue on Iran. We know that the two presidents speak to each other. They spoke in Biarritz, then they spoke in the margins of the UN General Assembly. Hopefully on trade, we are bound to be able to negotiate a settlement on the transatlantic trade disputes that we have, rather than enter into a tariff war. So there's nothing that we can do, but obviously this is something that we need to think about in terms of what is the response that we need to bring. And so one of the questions that's in policy planning, because that's what we do, planning, we are asking ourselves is, where is Trump leading us? That's my final point. So that question, you can look at it from three angles. First angle, the question for the US, or at least for the Republican foreign policy. Even in a redefined post-Trump GOP, there still is an alternative to Tucker Carlson. You may know that anchor from Fox News, 19th century type isolationism. Whoops. It's a new version of containment, this time of China, and as last time, allies and partners could play an essential role in it. It would come from a new mutation of the neoconservatives that would pay lip service to the new nationalism with a renewed focus on American hegemony. And the question is, does it bring us back to a more activist foreign policy or not? So that's the question within the GOP. Which of these two? There's a question where Trump is leading us, if you look at it from the angle of the world order. As Gordon says, there are evolutions in the distribution of power, there are evolutions within the international system. That leads to a fragilization of the post-1945 or the post-Cold War order. And this is not just a consequence of the Trump administration, of Trump's foreign policy. But clearly, he's more interested in primacy. So now I'm a bit lost with primacy, hegemony, etc. But let's say it like that. He's more interested in primacy by raw power relations than in primacy by rules, institutions, and leadership. And the question among Europeans, the question that Europeans are asking themselves, and if they are not, they should, is there such a thing as the possibility of a return to the status quo ante? Personally, I believe it's not possible for three reasons. First reason is because there was no status quo ante. It was already moving before Trump's election. And I think we had two excellent indications of that movement. There is no return either, because anticipations have changed. The perception of US foreign policy have changed among other powers, as well as among allies and partners. And in any case, we shouldn't be looking for a way back, because what we need is to prepare for the coming world, which is already at our doors, and maybe even a bit further than that. As a conclusion, what does it mean so for Europeans? We have to plan first for four different scenarios. So the first one is that Trump gets a second term, obviously. Another one is another GOP president. And so the question is, how much is GOP, the Republican Party's foreign policy, transformed by Trumpism? With this more nationalist, conservative, isolationist or unilateralist approach. There is the centrist or internationalist Democrats, or it could be pacifists or socialists, or what I believe Gordon called restraint Democrats. But we also have, if we look at things with a bit more long-term view, we have to plan for political polarization in the US, and therefore in US foreign policy making, with all the consequences that kind of polarization may bring for the future of US commitments. If a new president is willing to undo the achievements of his predecessor, then what is the future of these US international commitments, including key alliance commitments? And what do we want? What should we expect? What should we ask to the next administration? One of the things I believe which is clear is that in all scenarios, in all of these post-2020 scenarios, the time for free riding is over. Europe needs to be a more capable actor, a more capable partner. either to share more of the burden, more convincingly, I would say, or to be able to act on its own, and probably a little bit of both. We need both to be more autonomous. That's all the discussion about European sovereignty, not just about strategic autonomy. To be able to have more control over our destiny rather than relying on others. And more control over our destiny probably means more capabilities in terms of hard power too. And we need to be more strategic in our commitment to international cooperations, in particular, as a means to build the kind of stable world order which I think Europe should still consider as best for its security and its prosperity. Thank you.
That should be easy. Your whole conclusion on what Europe should do is very ambitious, but we'll see. Thank you very much, Manuel. I must say I didn't expect you to be so straightforward and robust in your presentation, and so I'm very grateful. Thank you. I'm going to open the floor for questions, but before I will ask one to you, Gordon. So you delineate those 4 schools, and it's quite easy to see where your heart is in the 4 schools.
On my sleeve.
Well, not only. I mean, you seem to be quite taken with the non-interventionist. Oh, sorry, non-interventionist. Sorry, but still quite much engaging school. And my question is, none of you have mentioned, or maybe you have, but the climate change issue and the fact that the current administration has pulled out from the Paris agreement on climate. So if you were to lead the next president's administration, I mean, for the sake of argument, what do you think the US should do in that respect?
It's a good question. One of the things when you're trying to cover as much terrain as I was trying to cover is some things get left out. But that leads me to say that there are actually 2 trends in the global system that I think are going to face any future American president, and each of these schools of thought have a different view of them. One I talked about a bit, which is the global power rebalancing, both global and regional. And that I've discussed pretty thoroughly and won't say more on it at the moment unless there are questions. But the other trend that I didn't talk about is the agenda of global issues that every country will face, not just the United States. But will face everybody, and they are issues of a kind that are only addressable, I won't say resolvable, but only addressable on a multilateral basis. That's a real challenge to a neoconservative or a America First approach, because both of those schools of thought explicitly reject the concept of multilateral action. Both place a lower priority on the uses and misuses of allies and partners. The liberal interventionist school, if you will, and the conservative interventionist school tend to address those global issues more frontally, but not always with solutions, I would say, that are going to lead us out of the jungle in any of those issues. The restraint approach is more deliberately multilateral, and I would say more self-consciously aware that the United States cannot solve every issue in the world, and that therefore those issues need to be addressed multilaterally, with other countries potentially playing a lead. The 3 that I would cite as most important here, number 1 is climate change. There is simply no way progress can be made on the reality of climate change without a multilateral solution. It's by definition one of those issues that a unilateral solution does not exist to. The second is migration and immigration, which is a common challenge that the European countries and the Americans face. But it goes beyond that with Rohingya migration into Bangladesh, for example. Many countries in the world now face a challenge of a shift in populations. There are now more than 60 million internal and displaced refugees in the world, which is an order of magnitude larger than any that we've ever encountered before, for which there is as yet no multilateral response and very inadequate resources. The only way that the politics of that issue, which push in a populist direction in many countries, there's no way that that's going to resolve the issue, and there's no way that pressure is going to change given the impact of economics and the impact of climate change. That climate change will, the global warming, let's call it what it is, global warming will lead to the loss of some countries altogether and the migration of populations from low-lying areas into other regions and other countries. So a massive displacement coming. Migration and immigration are a huge challenge today. They have confronted the Europeans directly. They confront the Americans directly in other countries. And the third is economic inequality. The globalized economy will at some point demand a more globalized set of principles and set of actions to address the political consequences of growing inequality in income and wealth terms around the world. Those three things I see as an underlying transnational dynamic that every country has to deal with. The current administration, Washington, has no answers to any of those three. The Europeans are struggling with answers to those three. Countries elsewhere, Brazil, India, Bangladesh, you name it, are struggling with all three. So I didn't address it basically because I had too many things on my plate, but I think it is the other major evolution of the global system that only has a multilateral answer.
And so your school that you described would take care of that?
I think it's, sorry, by definition, those issues only have a multilateral response. By definition, the United States is not going to be capable of resolving them, even necessarily leading the answer on their own. And what is contained within the thinking, within the restraint version, is the encouraging of other countries to step up to leadership commitments. For example, instead of positioning China versus America in dealing with climate change, the Chinese have every reason to step up to the issue of climate change, and in their region may very well be a leader. And one of the great difficult adjustments for American foreign policy, given the traditions that Michael and I talked about, is going to be to not only live with that, but encourage that. It's part of the evolution of the system that I described, that the United States will not necessarily be the leader, though it is a necessary participant in climate change, for example, because the United States is the single largest source of global warming, of the pollutants that go into the atmosphere that contribute to global warming. So American involvement is necessary. American leadership may or may not be.
Okay. Michael, your views on that, on this?
Yes, I will take issue with much of what my esteemed colleague has said. I will try to out-realist the realist. To begin with, I'm a global issues skeptic. I was a term member of the Council on Foreign Relations in the United States. I never applied for full membership because it was so boring. But it was useful because most speeches that began all of the countries of the world must unite to solve this problem, I learned to translate into the word must into will not. Okay? So whenever I heard this speech, this problem can only be solved if most countries unite. Looking at history, I said, well, then it's not going to be solved because they're not going to unite. One of the most powerful axioms in political science is called a Riker's coalition theory, named after William Riker in the 1960s. It says that if you want a status quo coalition to keep things from changing, you want as many members as possible. If you want a revisionist coalition to get something done, you want as few members as possible. And it was applied to World War II. Now, in both World War I and World War II, the anti-German coalition, eventually, by the end of both wars, they had all the South American states. It was like dozens and dozens of countries. Hitler, during World War I, and this is in his table talk, did not want fascist Spain part of the Axis because too many cooks spoil the broth. It's hard enough getting the three Axis powers to agree on anything, and since they're trying to overturn the world order, the last thing you want is to have to haggle with General Franco all day, right? So if you really wanted to address issues like climate change, the US, the EU, China, and India have the majority of the world's GDP. You would have a quadrilateral agreement. Who cares? Frankly, I'm just saying this as a realist. What's the point of signing up a majority of the members of the General Assembly? I mean, if China and the US bilaterally cut a deal, that would solve much of the problem right there. So there's this fetishism about involving lots and lots of states. The average independent country in the General Assembly, I read the other day, has around 15 million people. That's smaller than the city of Los Angeles. So I'm sorry if I sound like a great power chauvinist, but we're thinking about strategy here if you want to get things done. Climate change. There was bipartisan support in the United States among conservative Republicans and liberal Democrats for climate change, up to and including John McCain's run for president in 2008. He was pushing the cap and trade system, which became Waxman-Markey, a fairly good bill, which collapsed. I blame the left in the United States for poisoning climate change as an issue with Republicans, because people like Naomi Klein and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, instead of saying, let's focus on anthropogenic global warming from these technologies, they say, oh, but we also have to overthrow capitalism. Naomi Klein. Oh, and we also have to achieve racial and gender justice, okay? That has killed it for the next generation in the United States among Republicans, because they now view this, as they did not up until a few years ago, as a Trojan horse, where it's a bunch of left-wing policy ideas disguised as climate change, right? The Green New Deal has killed bipartisan collaboration with Republicans, I would guess for a decade, maybe for 25 years, right? When it's a bunch of proposals that are so extreme, they're not even supported by the Clinton-Biden wing of the Democratic Party. And this is what you have to do to have climate change, right? Get rid of eating meat, get rid of cars, get rid of airplanes. That has killed it. So that's just the political, it's not that evil oil companies paid propaganda to do this. I mean, this is what you read in the media. You know, in this case, the left has made it much more partisan than it needed to have done. A friend of mine works on a bipartisan project, which is Ted Halstead co-founded New America with me. Climate Progress has Democrats and Republicans, oil companies and tech companies and so on. It's suffering now because the left wing of the Democratic Party decided it's going to declare that oil company executives are war criminals who should be tried and arrested and put in jail. And there are lawsuits against oil and gas companies to try to bankrupt them. Well, needless to say, you're not going to get BP and Exxon and so on collaborating if the left is saying they're going to be bankrupted and go to jail. So that's climate change in the US politics. One more thing on the global level with climate change. The US emits 14% of greenhouse gases. 14%, less than China and India. Now, historically, we've done more, as did the British before us, but it's 14%. The US, according to the US Energy Information Administration, will emit fewer greenhouse gases from 2007 until 2040. Why? Because of fracking. Because natural gas, being cheaper, has replaced coal. And since natural gas has 1/4 of the CO2, the methane is a problem in some ways, but it's 1/4 of the CO2. That means that this was according to Obama's administration. I sat there when Obama's EIA chief said the U.S. has met its targets already because of fracking and natural gas replacing coal just through market things. So unless you have a plan for China and India to go off of coal in the relatively near future, as for France, as I understand it, the decision, to address climate change contributed to your Yellow Vest protests. I have British friends who have these ambitious schemes for becoming all renewable. Folks, frankly, and again, I don't want to sound like a great power chauvinist, it doesn't matter what the UK does compared to China and India and the US. It just, it's just negligible. So one last thought about immigration. I will disagree with that is a global issue on mathematical grounds. According to the United Nations, only 3% of the human race lives in countries other than the one in which they were born. 3%, okay? Now in Europe and North America, it's around 14%, but that's largely because of their voluntary immigration policies, driven by fear of demographic shrinkage. It's a class struggle. The labor movement, the working class in most democracies, wants fewer immigrants as competition. That's always been the case. Organized labor in the US up until 2000 was for immigration restriction, because workers want a seller's market in labor and a buyer's market in jobs. All employer lobbies want as many people competing for jobs as possible, and also being consumers and spending money and buying their products. So I do not believe that the Rohingya problem in Bangladesh is a European problem. I do not believe that Syrians moving to Europe, now obviously everything in the world is connected, but I don't think that's an American problem. I think that the fact that right now in the United States, the vast majority of people who are being smuggled across the border in labor trafficking schemes, and we should call these as what they are criminal mafia organized labor trafficking schemes where people pay in advance to be smuggled to the US, and they know exactly where they're going. The employers are waiting for them. This is labor trafficking. It's not this great humanitarian thing it's portrayed to be in most cases. It's the economic migration. The vast majority of, a majority of people sneaking across the US-Mexican border now are OTMs, other than Mexicans. There's a wave from Central America, but there are more and more Nigerians, Indians, Chinese, Pakistanis, and this is just pure economic migration. They get a ticket, they fly to Mexico, they pay the coyotes to sneak them to where often a relative is waiting, because they've arranged all this. They have cell phones, they have the internet, they have email. I assume I'm being the ugly American in the room by pointing out there's more than two sides to this. But I'm trying to be realistic. I do not think that a lot of these issues are truly global. They're going to be dealt with on a case-by-case basis by nation states. And if you want to do radical things, then remember Riker's law of coalition. The fewer people you have in an alliance, the more easily it is to do radical changes. We should hear from policy planning.
Thank you, Michael. This is why it's always so interesting to invite Michael over, because these ideas are refreshing in the extreme. Manuel, tu veux commenter? And you wanted to add something, actually.
Yes, there will be a lot to say. I will focus on climate for the sake of time. So I've heard already quite a lot this idea that to get something done, it's better to be as few as possible. I'm actually old enough to remember on climate that this is exactly what people were saying after the failure of the summit in Copenhagen in 2009. And everybody was saying this format is too big, it's too wide, it's too heterogeneous, let's work differently, let's get a few, the bigger emitting countries together and we'll find the solutions. And that failed. And what helped us in reaching a consensus was the UN process, universal, inclusive, actually so inclusive that it was not just government, it was also non-governmental actors. So I know there is this idea that still is around that in international collective action, you can be either legitimate or effective, and usually that's framed in a way that you eventually decide that obviously being effective is better. It's usually framed in a way that criticizes Europeans for this kind of fetishism of legitimacy, especially legitimacy by numbers. I don't think that there is this fetishism. In any case, I don't believe there is this fetishism anymore. And I have many other examples that you're hardly effective in the long run if you are not legitimate. If you go back to climate, for instance, it's true that what got China in the Paris climate deal was because the US was in the deal, and so it's important to have the big players. But would China still be in a deal if that deal had been only between the US and China, now that the US has withdrawn? The importance of this multilateral framework, one example, one illustration of the importance of that multilateral framework is precisely that except for the US, all of the other countries are still in the deal. And I believe that's an important achievement.
Quick thought, which is, I will shock my realist colleague by agreeing with him. That is to say, the major players here are the players that are going to have to matter. There is noticeably one major player missing. I'll leave it to you to guess who it is. Right? If that major player came into the global warming discussion and took a serious role, we might really have some progress on the issue. But that one player is not at the table, and that's the United States of America. So that's the difficulty. The difficulty is the one major power that is a major global emitter is not playing in the discussion. So I don't disagree that major players can make a great little difference. I'm not sure it's going to advance the ball very much unless all of the major players, and I think you've named the right ones, are at the table. So I'm a realist. I think that's right. The missing party is us.
Okay. Questions? I see one here, Laure, and then you, sir. Maybe we only have 15 minutes left, sorry. So maybe we'll take two at a time.
Yes. Can you hear me? Yeah, I have a question about China, because you, Michael, I think you mentioned that China is the most important priority for the US. Isn't it a field, the relationship with China, where the partnering with Europe should be actually extremely important? Because we've seen that Trump has been, trying to get, this sort of battle going with the Chinese, but he's struggling. And one very important part of this conversation is going to be the technology competition. And we see the Chinese coming right in, in Europe to try to convince the Europeans to sort of support them. And the Weihai, struggle is actually, of course, the symbolic of all that. So are you in that respect more keener on going multilateral? Because we've seen efforts to convince the Poles and others. So.
Thank you. Two questions. First, to both Manuel and Gordon. First is related to foreign policy decision process. Don't you feel that we have a crisis in this respect with Donald Trump? We see first that the State Department has still some positions not filled, even today. Second, more important, we have seen that till John Bolton was fired, he constantly sidelined the National Security Council, like Pompeo, by the way. And when Trump fired him, in his tweet, he told very tellingly, I'm firing you because I'm in disagreement with you, but with others. We showed that at least the Pentagon was very, very unhappy with Bolton taking risk. And we have seen the Congress raising concerns of on Bolton being out of control. So don't you feel that, my first question, that there is a kind of institutional crisis in this team, in particular with Jared Kushner playing a specific role both as diplomat and business partner? Second question, more briefly, to Gordon Bennett. Do you feel that we can say that United States have an independent foreign policy vis-à-vis Israel, keeping in mind Israel's influence within Congress? I'm referring to John Meshame's book that you certainly knew. It's some articles in your think tank.
Yeah, I think that Trump's policy towards Europe has been stupid and destructive in terms of his own goals. That is, the Obama administration, I think, was correct in thinking that if you're going to have countervailing power against a mercantilist, state capitalist China, then having the biggest possible bloc with the biggest possible integrated market with the biggest firms. And size matters in high technology firms. It matters in these platforms that France and the EU and the US are having disputes over. And the reason is you have increasing returns of scale in manufacturing, which means that if you look at the leading countries, the national origin of the leading multinationals of the world, if you look at the top 10, the UN has these statistics. There are 3 countries: the United States, Germany, and Japan. The 3 most populous capitalist nation states. And France is up there too. Having a big internal market as a launching pad for your global markets that's why Olympic medalists tend to come from big countries rather than teeny little ones. There's more competition at home. So I think it's a great tragedy for both the US and Europe that TAFTA failed, the transatlantic free trade area. That was discussed in the 80s and 90s. And I think that the fact that the TTIP just kind of fizzled out without much attention, that was a tragedy too, because if China is going to try to break into the global jetliner market, and if they have unlimited state funding, they can lose funding, dump their products in global markets, their jets, wipe out Boeing and Airbus if they want to, then why not have a Boeing-Airbus merger? Why not have transatlantic national champions? Obviously, people who see Europe as a rival of the US would be against this. I don't think Americans view Europe as a commercial threat in that way. There are particular companies in industries that have political influence. But it's my recollection that the US was pushing both TAFTA and TTIP for strategic reasons. And what always kills these transatlantic proposals for a transatlantic bloc, it's the farmers on both sides. So if you can get over, the clash of farmers, I think the industrialists would benefit. It would make a lot of strategic sense.
I pretty much agree with what Michael just said on the importance of allies when you've got a strategic purpose in mind. And I think in the case of China, one of the 2 most disastrous decisions of the Trump administration's foreign policy was to step out of the TPP. The second most disastrous was to step out of the joint agreement on Iran. But those are now steps done, and so we're having to clean up after those steps. The question of process is, it's quite fascinating to Washington insiders, and having played that role at one point, I'm quite fascinated with it. What we have seen really is an almost totally disruptive policy process. I mean, two things that have happened. One, whatever machinery you think worked in defining what the president wanted to do in foreign policy has been blown up. And so we're completely dealing in an ad hoc universe. It depends on who the players are, and it depends on who has Donald Trump's ear. That's literally what it depends on. There will be nothing systematic coming out of this process. We've literally been through 3, and I think we're now working on a 4th process in the National Security Council since the beginning of the administration. But it is clearly not driving the train. Tweets are driving the train. And very often what the process has to do is go back and re-engineer the explanation for the tweet. And I'm not making that up. It's not a critique, it's an observation. Well, that makes for utter discontinuity and unpredictability in the policy process, whatever you think of the substance. The other major thing that's going on, which is what the piece I did for Quincy addresses, is the sort of thoroughgoing destruction of America's diplomatic machinery. That's happened in the State Department. Rex Tillerson started it. Mike Pompeo has done very little to correct it. There's rhetoric about swagger in American diplomacy, but it doesn't show that swagger. It can't, right? And because you have, I actually brought the statistics with me, but we have something like a disappearance of about 20% of the minister, counselor level people. We have less than half the number of applicants taking the Foreign Service exam that did before this administration came into office. We have extreme disgruntlement in the diplomatic machinery. I go on to say in that piece that just giving them more money and more people will not solve the dysfunctionality of the State Department. But what we've seen is any functionality it had has essentially been blown up. So I don't know how somebody like Monsieur Rapnouil at the end deals with his American counterparts, because it's not clear anymore who matters in terms of who you're dealing with. There's no clear spokesperson. On the third point that you raise, I think it's a third critical strategic error by the United States administration to decide that Benjamin Netanyahu's policy was the policy we should endorse, support, and act on. So we have now taken steps that make the role of the United States as any mediator in that situation, which may be almost unsolvable, even worse. So it's one of the steps, along with withdrawing from the joint agreement over Iran, that I think has almost thoroughly eroded any American influence in the region.
Very quickly, on China, I agreed with the part of what Laure said that was not a question. The problem is not just TAFTA or TTIP, it's the multilateral approach to these trade issues, and what the US administration is doing to the WTO, especially by blocking nominations of appellate body judges, is a major issue. On the process crisis, it's never a good idea for diplomats to plead for other diplomats because we are not very convincing usually, so I'm glad Gordon said a few things about that. Back channels have always been part of foreign policy, not just in the US, so it's not the back channel in itself which is an issue. And in terms of how do we adjust to that, precisely, the question for us is not so much is it a crisis or not, is how do we adapt. So obviously we still work with the bureaucracy, we still work with Congress, which still plays a significant role. But I think that the way President Macron directly engages with his US counterparts is a good illustration of this need for adaptation.
Okay, so I see no questions, so I will jump and... Oh, too bad. Okay, please. I had a good one.
Thank you. Yeah, just to follow up on this destructive trend that was mentioned of the Trump's foreign policy. We've seen him withdraw from quite a few international agreements or even institutions, and not really replacing the existing things by anything new. What do you think will be left of NATO, the WTO, or a few other institutions when he's done with them? Thank you.
Okay, let's call this the last question but one, and then I add mine now, and you reply, and we're done. So we've discussed Trump's foreign policy at length. My question to you two is if a democratic president is elected next year, and so we have a choice of names here, but according to the one you think is would be most likely, what would be his or her foreign policy going forward? And it's not easy, but...
Okay, a couple of small questions to finish.
Easy.
Piece of cake, morceau de gâteau, pas de problème. Honest answer about NATO, WTO, and other international organizations is I don't know, but with a caveat. And the caveat is that the dilemma that faced those organizations precedes Donald Trump and will follow Donald Trump. So that what I was trying to say at the beginning is I think what Trump has done is accelerate trends that were already underway. So the future role of NATO was always a question. It's now being posed in a much more cacophonous and disruptive way, as the Macron-Trump exchange indicated. But it's always been disruptive, you know, and it's a huge disagreement, which we won't go into in a very much here because it's a huge issue. But the disagreement within NATO about burden sharing is, to my knowledge, at least 40 or 5 decades old. It's not anything particularly new, not anything that has particularly changed. It's just that Trump stepped on the accelerator and said, damn it, you will do it. I've always been somebody, I testified on this issue 40 years ago before the Congress, who has felt that this is simply the wrong question in dealing with the defense relationship across the Atlantic. Burden sharing depends on people sharing the burden. Now, the question is, do both countries define what the burden is in the same way? And what NATO's role, therefore, needs to be in that burden. So when we talk about comparing spending features, when one country defines the burden as global and the other describes the burden as predominantly regional, with extensions to Afghanistan, you have a substantive argument that can't be solved by numbers. It has to be solved by dealing with the policy discussion, and that's not what's been happening in NATO for a very long time. So that's my first sense. Second off, you know, a percentage of the gross domestic product dedicated to defense tells you this much about the military capabilities of any country. That much. Zero. Doesn't tell you a damn thing. Either what the capabilities are or what the capacity is of any defense institution. So it's an argument around the wrong target to begin with. But that question of what the capability is required is hinged to the first question, which is, what's the burden? And therefore, what capability do you need? So that's the first question. The second question, smaller, even smaller question. Thank you very much. I don't think anybody knows what the answer to that is going to be, because fundamentally, at least from my point of view, foreign policy rarely determines the outcome of presidential elections. So most candidates for the presidency do not spend an awful lot of time speaking to, worrying about foreign policy issues. I've served on the issue staffs of 5 presidential campaigns, and everyone discharged its defense and foreign policy issue as quickly as they could, got it off the table in one speech, and went on to the domestic political issues that are going to dominate. What will drive a presidential outcome, however, is the question of leadership. And that's going to be real, and that's a foreign policy question. That says, is that person look to the electorate like somebody who is going to be able to represent the United States to the world? Are they going to be a good leader, a strong leader, an articulate leader, somebody who understands the issues? And that leadership question is, in fact, very important in the primaries and in the general election for president. That I can't answer yet because we haven't seen. yet, I think, from any of the Democratic candidates, except Joe Biden, who has an obvious resume, what is going to look like a good, strong Democratic leader in foreign policy. I suspect, short answer, that the outcome is more likely to be in that tension around liberal interventionism, if you will, liberal internationalism. How much, how little, how dedicated, how central. And as I said earlier, I don't think that's going to confront the global change that that new president's going to face.
Thank you. Michael, your reply.
Well, to the first question, the U.S., like many post-colonial Western Hemisphere states, is intensely sovereigntist. The first peacetime alliance to which the United States ever joined after acquiring its independence in 1776 was NATO. It's the only peacetime alliance in American history before then. The Senate killed the League of Nations agreement because Wilson insisted that there had to be automaticity to it. That is, if the League declared that members had to go to war against an aggressor, then all countries were bound. And the Senate Republicans, who wanted a Franco-American-British reinsurance treaty against German aggression, they said, no, 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 we get to choose when we go to war. So Franklin Roosevelt avoided that mistake. And in the UN Charter, it says action it depends on the domestic constitutional processes of all states. The UN cannot order anything. Every state, and that language is in there so that the UN Charter passed. I was here in Europe in the Bush administration, George W. America was destroying the liberal international world order because it wouldn't join the International Criminal Court. So none of this stuff started with Trump. There's this deep, profound suspicion of being entrapped and being forced to do things against your interest. It may be irrational, but it's a deeply part of American culture and probably will remain so. Let's take 4 presidential candidates who I think are probably the 4 most likely. If it's Biden or Buttigieg, you'll get something like a restoration of the Clinton administration, complete with Jake Sullivan as Secretary of State and Jason Furman as Secretary of Treasury. So, you know, those sorts of people will just be, you know, come back in the same way the Obama administration was largely the Clinton administration, you know, stage 2. And I think that's true of Buttigieg too. He's rising in the polls now, who knows? But he's seen as being part of this centrist lane with Biden and is getting a lot of support from the Clinton-Obama backers who are skeptical about Biden being able to make it all the way. Elizabeth Warren is quite a trade hawk, an economic nationalist, and pro-manufacturing and anti-Chinese mercantilism. In many ways, she's not all that different in that narrow sense of the Sino-American trade conflict from Trump. And I think Sanders, in the off chance that he became president, because of the labor union support and you know, the pro-manufacturing mystique that was part of socialism, you know, I think he would be in that Elizabeth Warren trade hawk camp. And one of the reasons this doesn't come up is it really divides the Democratic Party as much as trade divides the Republican Party. So both parties have their pro-trade and their protectionist economic nationalist wings. So it's not so much a partisan divide as a divide within each party.
Very quickly, what will be left of institutions? So I would agree with Gordon that most institutions, that the one you mentioned, the one we can think of, already had major challenges facing them even before President Trump was elected. Second, some of these institutions are in this kind of paradoxical situation that President Macron, for instance, characterized in the case of NATO, that some of it is working pretty well. In the case of NATO, the military cooperation level, but the political and strategic uncertainty is part of the problem. You may be aware of an initiative led by Minister of Foreign Affairs from France and Germany, Jean-Yves Le Drian and Heiko Maas, which is called the Alliance for Multilateralism, which precisely starts with this idea that most of these international institutions or set of rules or regimes, etc., are facing these kind of challenges, and that those who want to that still support this more multilateral approach to world order need to work together. And I just want to give you a quick glimpse of what this alliance is meant for by mentioning the 3 priorities that Minister Le Drian gives, which are contributing. Part of what is lacking right now for these international institutions is the lack of contribution, and contribution is financial contributions, but not only, it's also political expertise, it's also technical expertise, political capital, troops, military capabilities, etc., etc. The second axis, the second priority is reform, because the question is not so much can we get these institutions left, but how do we prepare these institutions for the challenges that are coming to us? Most of these institutions need to adapt, need to change, and that's a key issue. It's not about defending the status quo for the multilateral system. It's about preparing the multilateral system for the challenges that we will be facing. And the third one is give new impulses, because there are some areas in which multilateral cooperation already is there and exists, and it's not as effective as it should be, but there are also other areas where it does not exist. And digital is one key area, for instance, where a lot can be done. And I have maybe one comment on if there's a democratic president, what its foreign policy will be about. My colleague Célia Belin has this interesting idea that the foreign policy of the next democratic president may depend on the analysis of the reasons of Trump's victory last time. For instance, just to give you a quick example, if you think that was a mistake, that was an error, that was just a result of Russian interference, for instance, then you think that you can go back to where you were in 2016 and just renew the thread. If you think, on the contrary, that had to do, for instance, with the centrality of economic and social questions, then probably you go for more restraint, you go for some responsibility avoidance, maybe, in any case, with more of this transactional logic or economic nationalism, maybe, that was just mentioned. So that's an interesting idea, because I agree foreign policy is not so much, does not feature prominently in the debate, but if you make the link with this analysis of why is it that Trump won in the first place, then you have a good suggestion of where this is taking you. Thank you.
Okay, well, and with that we conclude our panel and we conclude our conference. You know what, I'll make a confession. I was so worried about the strike and that, you know, no one would show up for this. And thanks to you, it's been a big day, and I'm very happy, and thank you very much. And thank the panelists.